Now, I want to say a little bit about self-publishing because there are a lot of people in prison who self-publish. They put a book together and then they get their people to publish it on Amazon or some other self-publishing company out there. Usually what's going on with self-publishing is that you are paying some company like Amazon or Zulon to publish your material. In a situation with a university press like the University of Chicago Press or one of the commercial presses like McGraw-Hill, that publishing company probably went to the author because the author is well known in their world of academics and research. And the publishing company asked the author if the author will write a book for that publishing company. But when you're self-publishing, it's the opposite. You as the author are going to the publishing company and asking if they will publish something on your behalf. Now, sometimes you can go to a legitimate publishing company and get them to publish your work. But in the case of self-publishing, you're literally just paying some company to publish your information. Now, let's think about the first marker that I mentioned about whether or not the book you're looking at is reliable. I said, look at who published it. Well, in the context of self-publishing, you don't really know. All you know is that the author paid a company to publish that book. So just looking at the publishing company, you don't have any real way of knowing whether that information is reliable or credible. Now, in the world of self-publishing, there are some indicators you can kind of gather whether or not it's reliable. But for the most part, if somebody has self-published a book, which is what a lot of people in prison have done, you really don't know, just from looking at it, whether the information is worth your time and whether it's reliable. However, I don't want to undermine the idea of people in prison self-publishing books. All I'm saying is that just looking at the book, not having read it yet, just looking at it, you don't really have a good way to tell whether or not it's going to be worth your time and reliable. You have to actually do a little bit more investigation to make that judgment. But I don't want to undermine the idea of self-publishing books because, number one, I was in prison for a few years as a young adult, and I've worked in and out of the prison system for the last 20 years. And I know that there are people who, if they were out here in the world, would be considered credible scholars. They have the intellect, they have the know-how, they have the skill, they have the education. They read and write very well. It's just that they're in prison, and so they don't have access to a really important publishing company to get their work published. So I don't want to undermine people like that. There are people in prison who are very well educated and write well and write important information. I'm just saying that looking at the book, you can't really tell until you've read it. So I'm going to talk about a few books that are written by people in prison that I know and explain a little bit of the difference. So this one is the first one. It's called Redemption Through the Eyes of the Condemned, which is a commentary on Romans by John Montana. So a commentary on Romans means that this is a book which has looked at one of the books in the Bible called Romans. And he's explaining verse by verse what the book of Romans means. So if you're a Christian or a Muslim or a Jewish, if you're religious in any way, then you're probably familiar with commentaries. Commentaries, I have a bunch of them behind me. I have quite a few commentaries on the Bible. If you have, this is another commentary on the Bible on the book of Philippians by the Word Biblical Commentary. If you have a Bible that has like footnotes in the bottom, it might also provide some commentary on what the Bible means. Well, this is a commentary on Romans, and John Montana is serving time in prison. He's been serving time in prison for over a decade now. I happen to know him personally. I know a lot of what he went through to do the research on this book. I know he also has been mentored by a world-renowned biblical scholar who has written one of these large academic commentaries on Romans. His name is Douglas Moo. So I know that John Montana has been in correspondence with Douglas Moo for many years as his mentor. And so even though this is self-published by John Montana, who's currently serving time in prison, because I happen to know him and I know what he went through to do his research and I know who his mentor is, this is a book that I would consider to be reliable in its explanation of a commentary on Romans. That doesn't mean that I agree with everything he says, and it doesn't mean that what he says is true. I would like to think it's true, but that doesn't mean what he says is true. It just means that He's a person in prison who went through a lot of trouble to do research, and it's the kind of research that is actually recognized by a world-class scholar and many more. So just to note that there are people in prison who I think can produce good material. It's just that if you don't know them personally, you don't know how to evaluate it until you've actually read it. Now, that's an example of a nonfiction book, right? But I've got a couple of examples of fictional accounts by people who are in prison. Philip Yao, this is the first of a series of books called The Ripple Effect. And Jameson Charles, good friend of mine who's out here, called Saved-ish. Sometimes it's hell getting to heaven. So these are not nonfiction, so you wouldn't read these because you're necessarily trying to learn some truth about the world, although they talk about some things in here that are true and wise. But this is not like your go-to book as a research book to understand the truth about the world. But they are also in prison, and they're both great writers. Another would be Exiles, A Prisoner's Daily Devotional. This, again, was written by people who are serving time in prison. I know all three of them. They put a lot of effort into this. And an interesting guy just happened to do the back cover to this. His name is Brandon Warren. All of that just to say that if you are in prison, you've written books, you've self-published them. I'm not bashing you for that. I'm just saying that someone who doesn't know you, if they're trying to evaluate whether your book is worth their time, if it's reliable, they can't just look at it and tell, because the publishing company is not necessarily one that has a high academic standing.